Okay, we're on YouTube. You're good to go.
So good. So, welcome to everybody again to Sarah's talks on hope and virtue, and the virtue of hope, and our hope to be virtuous. So thank you, Sarah, for being with us again from Canberra. And I think today you're going to be, I just see a comment has just come in. I think it's very urgent. You should know about this. After the 6 weeks of intense theological and philosophical reflection, somebody would like you to know that they love your scarves.
Thank you.
And another word of greetings from Lisa in Oslo, so from all over the world. Thank you again, Sarah, for these weeks, and this week you're going to be, I think, giving us a kind of recapitulation, and you've also been working on the questions and comments that people have been sending you. So we look forward to this with great eagerness. Thank you for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again, Father Lawrence, and everyone at Bonvo, and everyone who's joined us for this last in this 6-week series. As Father Lawrence said, tonight I'm wanting to recapitulate a little bit because we've covered quite a lot of terrain, so just to try to draw some of the threads together. And as part of that, I've been trying to respond to the questions and comments that have been coming through the whole series, but particularly this last week. I haven't necessarily been able to pick up on every comment or question, and so I'm sorry if you feel that a particular question you had isn't answered. I hope there'll still be time at the end for some more questions, and I will be trying to respond by email as well if people have particular things they want to raise. So I'll start with a quote from the text we've been using, 1 Peter. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. Well, these opening lines from the first letter of Peter suggested the title for this series of talks, A Living Hope. And over the past 6 weeks, in dialogue with this text, we've been exploring what this birth into a living hope is said to promise for human being. Tonight, as I said, I hope we can recapitulate some of what we've explored so as to distill insights and deepen our sense of where we've come and what is opening before us. As I was reflecting back on the series as a whole, I wanted to draw out 4 themes that I think have emerged as key and which many of you have picked up in your questions and comments. The first theme concerns the relationship between discipleship and ethics, or between spirituality and morality. I've used the phrase Christian virtue quite a bit, and I've been conscious it runs various risks. Virtue itself is a tricky word. It can have connotations of a certain kind of striving or muscular moral effort. It can seem inherently moralistic, as if our good character is something we're self-consciously cultivating and displaying. And in English literature, you might think of some of the self-consciously virtuous and so usually horrible characters in Charles Dickens or Jane Austen to get the flavour of this. And I'm sure the same kind of dynamic is present in the literatures of other languages. The notion of Christian virtue runs the further risk of seeming implicitly to claim religious possession of this moral high ground, as if Christian virtue is more virtuous than any other kind of virtue. Yet obviously, concern for people's character and values are not exclusive to Christianity. Philosophical and religious traditions the world over, including Indigenous and humanistic traditions, have cared about the nature of the good life and sought to form people to live well in community. Yet, having acknowledged all this, a striking feature of the New Testament is its claim that a particular quality of goodness has become newly visible and available to people through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The New Testament letters make comparisons between the lives people used to lead or think normal and the lives they're now being called into. 1 Peter, for example, says, "Do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance." For the early Christians, it's as if in the context of their first century Jewish and Greco-Roman culture, they experience themselves being differently. Their new lives as disciples of Christ involved new and hitherto unimaginable forms of relationship, a new sense of what ultimately matters, a new experience of freedom and belonging, which liberates a new kind of care for and communion with others. Christian virtue has a certain identifiable content. And what I've tried to emphasize is that these ways of being are not just a list of moral values that this new community and tradition happen to approve of and require their members to commit to. Rather, these dispositions, these virtues, actually begin to arise in people as they are connected more fully and deeply to the life of God through their relationship with Jesus. And this changes how we understand the whole energy or dynamic of moral life. For one thing, it means that Christian virtue is primarily a fruit of grace rather than human achievement. It is the natural outworking in human beings of God's presence within us. It's who we can expect to become as we are liberated from compulsion and self-preoccupation and come to share the mind of Christ. This doesn't mean there's no effort required on our part, no exercise of the will. We must put ourselves in the way of grace and resist the lure of what takes us away, the lure of selfishness and separation. 1 Peter exhorts its readers to discipline yourselves and to rid yourselves of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. But the letter also insists that there's a sense in which holiness of life, virtue, is about participating in a goodness that is given rather than pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. On this understanding, moral life shifts from a matter of primarily will-based, self-conscious cultivation of character to being the fruit of a certain kind of receptivity. And a number of you wrote, recognizing this dynamic in your own experience. Someone offered a comment that raised an important subtlety here. She noted that even once we've distinguished between the role of grace and effort in relation to virtue, we can still fall into the trap of considering virtue as something to be attained. We can start striving for grace too, for example, or seeking to possess it. And she asked, ultimately, do we need to let this go too? And I think yes. In the first talk, I quoted David Ford speaking of the strange truth that on the Christian understanding, there is no direct way to goodness. We do not construct a good life. There is something more fundamental than that sort of action. It is more like, he says, the active passivity of letting ourselves be embraced, or letting ourselves be fed the food and drink that can energize us for virtue. And meditation is, I think, one of the most important ways we practice this active passivity. It's how we begin intentionally to let go, not just our striving to be virtuous, but even our striving after grace, after God. This is a paradox because there is a sense in which we do will or desire God. That's why we meditate. That's the yearning of our hearts. And yet it's as if our yearning, our will to participate in God's goodness must itself be purified of lingering traces of self-making, possessiveness, striving after accomplishment, if we are truly to receive. This is the grand poverty that John Main identifies with the faithful repetition of the mantra. If truly Christian virtue is the fruit of our openness to, our participation in the life of God, then self-dispossessing prayer is the means by which we grow in it and are available for it. And it's only by means of this prayer that the virtues themselves are progressively purified, such that my love becomes less possessive or self-referencing, my generosity less self-conscious, my humility more free, and so on. And this highlights another feature of Christian virtue. Not only does the virtuous person participate in the life of God, but she makes manifest the nature of God. Those who are truly loving or generous or humble as God is, give glory to God in the sense that they make God known, as Jesus makes God known. Someone sent a comment wondering if virtue could be seen as an incarnational aspect of God's grace enfleshed through us as we are willing to receive it. And I would say, yes, I think that's exactly right. On this vision then, Christian moral life is essentially relational and responsive. Goodness is not just a matter of learning the rules or cultivating pre-approved dispositions. There's a livingness to Christian virtue, a relationality, a vulnerability. We are formed by and responsive to the one who calls us, letting ourselves be led like obedient children, as Peter writes. And all this means that prayer, especially contemplative prayer, is at the heart of Christian moral life. And it brings me also to the second of the key themes that have emerged from our series, which is the question of obedience. Obedience is at the heart of Christian ethics because Christian life is about being conformed as Jesus was to the being and action of God. The difficulty is that in trying to work out what this means in practice, our conception of obedience has too often been sub-Christian. Our image is that of forced submission to an alien will, rather than free acceptance of that in which fullest life consists. Someone expressed this distinction beautifully and really helpfully in a comment. She noted that there is a traditional, hierarchical, and indeed patriarchal concept of obedience that most of us grew up with. Do this because I say so, and I have authority over you. A concept that might apply in the family, at work, and of course, often in church. In other words, obedience implies a top-down system and ultimately allows for someone to avoid taking personal responsibility for their actions with the excuse, I was only following orders. And she went on, a completely different starting point could be the idea of obedience as being in tune with the other, whether this is a fellow human being or God. She related this notion to the Johannine theme of abiding. Jesus and the Father, and by extension, all believers, abiding as the vine and the branches. Here, our obedience to God, our participating in the vine, is necessarily manifested in the quality of our relationships with each other. And this leads to a radically different outcome from the traditional top-down approach. It's also one, she says, that challenges a prevalent individualistic Christian outlook of it's mainly about just me obeying God. Well, this notion of obedience as being in tune with God reflects the contemplative sense of obedience as listening. And the insight that this deepening attunement with God shows up in the quality of our listening for and communion with others resonates strongly with the New Testament witness. 1 Peter, for example, speaks of people who are purified by their obedience to God, to truth, having genuine mutual love for one another. And so the person who sent this comment in, I think, wonderfully clarifies the extent to which our whole concept of obedience needs to be transformed by the example of Jesus abiding in and obedience to the Father. As I said before, on this understanding, obedience is not forced submission to an alien will, but free consent to that in which our fullest life consists. And I think this way of expressing it helps distill the insights that have emerged as we've wrestled with this difficult theme. If obedience is about deep listening and attunement to God, to truth, then it does involve being dispossessed of my merely egoic will and desire. Profound expression of this in the words of Mary, let it be unto me according to thy word. And sometimes this dispossession comes as a profound relief and joy. At last, I can get past myself and my neuroses. At other times, however, the process of this ultimately liberating self-dispossession may be acutely painful. I want something and I can't have it. there can be a kind of dying involved in aligning my will with reality, accepted as God's will. The question that needs to be faced, however, is how we discern between this painful but necessary self-dispossession as we attune ourselves to God, to the real, and the kind of forced or coerced obedience that results merely in destruction. A number of you raised questions along these lines, particularly in relation to situations of abuse. It seems to me that the first thing to say is that it is not God's will that anyone or any community be diminished, colonised, their life prospects thwarted or systematically denied. Even when some of the New Testament letters exhort people to accept the authority of what seem to us destructive or at least limiting life situations, these people are addressed as agents, beloved of God, and those in power over them are exhorted to show them honour and regard. The whole point of Christianity is to liberate and empower people to grow in God. Rowan Williams writes that we must therefore ask of any human association whether it is making it more or less difficult for people to grow into a maturity in which they are free to give to one another and nourish one another, free enough to know that they have the capacity to be involved in the work of God, in recreating others. And where a human association systematically thwarts this possibility, it cannot be uncritically endorsed. And this means that it can never be okay for the church or anyone else to exhort those in abusive situations to accept them as God's will for them. Yet, I've just said that obedience can involve being painfully dispossessed of my egoic will and desire. How do I know when I'm in a situation that I need to accept or consent to, even if it is painful, in the faith that ultimately this consent is transformative and leads to life? How do I know when I'm in that kind of situation? Or when I am in a situation that I must resist or refuse or seek to change? And I think what we need to attend to here is what actually happens as we practice obedience, as we give ourselves to God, willing to relinquish our will if it be God's will. Some of you wrote of your experiences of coming to the point of obedience in relation to a difficult life circumstance, accepting a diagnosis, accepting the state of a relationship, accepting the thwarting of plans, and your experience of how ultimately, in the process of relinquishment, there came a surprising peace. This is the obedience Jesus practiced when he set his face to Jerusalem, when he yielded himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. The paradox of obedience in such cases is that by getting to the point of freely consenting to a reality, a necessity we would not at first have chosen, what emerges is a new kind of freedom. We go through the narrow gate in such a way as to allow space for grace, for God to enter. But there can be other circumstances in which I seek to practice radical acceptance or consent. I'm willing to relinquish my own agenda and to embrace the suffering involved. Yet the process does not yield to fuller life. I do not come to peace or break through into deeper freedom. There's just entrapment, thwarting, a sense of persistent dis-ease. And in these kinds of cases, it seems to me that being obedient, in the sense of being in tune with God and with the truth of things, may be precisely what empowers me to realize the futility of a particular situation or relational dynamic, and so to refuse continued acceptance of or submission to it. Even here, however, what the work of obedience will have enabled is freedom to respond not purely out of egoic reactivity, but out of connection to the life of God. And this affects the manner of our refusal or protest or disengagement. It's likely to enable responses that are more empowering and creative, and that leave open space for the possibility of future reconciliation. This is a space of non-violent action or civil disobedience. Of course, there are situations where this possibility of ultimate reconciliation is never realised because the other party is wedded to violence or coercion and control. But if God's continuous action is to reconcile and recreate, then our call is to be joined as best we can to what enables that unfolding. One final comment that relates to this theme of obedience. Someone asked, does your understanding of the shape of Christian virtue continue to evolve? What practices support the evolution of a faith for our time? And unlikely as it seems, my sense is that it's the practice of obedience that supports the evolution of a faith for our time. Because true obedience is about listening, radical attunement, and responsiveness to what God is doing here and now. We've spoken of the discomfort we feel with some of the New Testament exhortations to obedience in relation to specific first century social institutions. But it's also the practice of obedience, I think, that has allowed for the evolution in our view of such things. It's obedience that renders Christian morality not just an ossified collection of rules and values, but a vital responsivity to the living God, requiring of us that we continuously deepen our capacity to listen and collectively discern. I know that's often not how the notion of obedience is understood by the church. Calls to be obedient to tradition or to the Bible are often used to mandate there be no change or evolution. But this, once again, is that traditional, hierarchical, sub-Christian conception of obedience as submission to an authority with power over us. And it seems to be contrary to the whole dynamic of our faith, in which time and again a living obedience draws disciples in directions they might once have thought of as ungodly. You might think of Peter's vision in the Acts of the Apostles, the blanket with the unclean animals lowered, and how that led him to visit the Gentile Cornelius, something he thought was wrong for him to do. You might think of how obedience, this living responsivity, was part of the evolution in attitudes to circumcision, for example. In our day, I think the practice of obedience, in the sense of deep listening to God and our fellow human beings, is evolving our understanding of sexuality and gender, such that for Christians, the virtuous life can no longer be simply equated with heterosexuality or binary gender identity. Likewise, the practice of obedience, deep listening to God, to the wisdom of other traditions, to our fellow creatures, is helping us realise that care for the natural world is absolutely core to Christian life. Parker Palmer once wrote that the difficult insight at the heart of contemplative life is that truth is always preferable to illusion, no matter how closely the illusion conforms to our notion of the good, or how far the truth diverges from it. Obedience, attunement, is our access to truth. The third theme to focus on is the particularity of Christian virtue. You might remember in our talks after obedience in week 2, we went on to explore the character of other key Christian virtues. We looked at the source and nature of the so-called theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And the following week, we considered the moral or human virtues, noticing particularly that the dispositions called forth by discipleship are those that conduce to the building up of community. And I tried to bring out what was distinctive about this emphasis on mutual building up by drawing a contrast with Aristotle's notion of virtue as intrinsically connected to the cultivation of honour or the accumulation of honour, and so to the competition for status. We noted, for example, that humility, leading to genuine mutual regard between people of different social status, which is enjoined many times in the New Testament, could never have been considered a virtue in Greco-Roman culture. Well, I've received a number of questions pertaining to this issue of the particularity of Christian virtue. Many of us are rightly nervous about claims to do with Christian distinctiveness because of how such claims have so often been combined with assertions of superiority and the diminishment of other traditions. Moreover, without a comparative exploration of other traditions, which I'm not qualified to undertake, it's hard to say just how distinctive some aspects of Christian virtue are. I've taken the risk of speaking in these terms, however, for 2 reasons. One is that I think it's possible for us to forget the depth dimension of our own tradition. One of you wrote in, "It seems that we in Western society, especially in politics, are still influenced by Greek philosophy and mistakenly believe that caring for the poor from a magnanimous perspective is appropriate and Christian. We thus get notions of the deserving poor, a welfare system that safeguards taxpayers' money, and an attitude of paternalism towards Indigenous communities, to mention but a few of the consequential attitudes that follow from Aristotelian magnanimity. The Church sadly has been complicit in this, as seen lately in the Royal Commission on Sexual Abuse in the Church." Once we forget the depth dimension of the tradition, it does become increasingly difficult to see what is distinctive about Christian moral life. Someone else wrote concerning Christian participation in the work of the world, in the work of justice, with non-Christians. He said, many of them would not accept any belief in a God, but nevertheless are, in his view, in contact with the divine. For example, in the UK, we have heard every day of health workers and ordinary care workers daily risking their health and their lives to do the job that they feel called to do. It's certainly not about money. And he goes on, does God also call forth prophets from these non-believers? Is Greta Thunberg a prophet? She certainly has the right profile, an unimportant, marginal person in the world. So what difference does being a Christian really make? What is distinctive about Christian virtue? And my response goes something like this. It's absolutely true that vast numbers of those giving extraordinary service to others, caring for the welfare of the whole, or prophetically speaking truth to power, are not Christians or believers of any kind. I take it for granted that God is at work well beyond the boundaries of the church, whether or not God is named or recognised. And I agree that very often Christians and Christian language just get in the way, and we're better off without it. Yes, yes, yes. And yet, something became available because of Jesus. A new vision of reality as sourced in and constituted by love. This gave rise to a new kind of universal community, a community devoted to the mutual upbuilding and care of its members. In this community, the practice of justice, generosity, and service had a particular flavour. Not the patronising magnanimity of great men relating honourably to lesser beings, nor a utilitarian calculation about the social arrangements maximising self-interest. Just a community of love, of genuine solidarity, liberating, enabling, generative, welcoming. And all sourced, not in human ideals or good intentions, but in receptivity to gift. And so constantly returning to the space of vulnerability and openness, mercy, penitence, and forgiveness for failure. I do not wish to argue that it is only Christians who live this way, and obviously we often fail. Nor that only Christianity proclaims this possibility for being. But Christianity does proclaim it. As the comment I quoted previously shows, we cannot take for granted that even in Christianized societies, this is how human beings imagine their relatedness to one another, in social or political life, in families or institutions or liberation movements, or even in the church itself. The task then is to remember who we're called to be, to keep alive this possibility for human being. And this is why it's worth reminding ourselves of what is distinctive about Christian virtue. And it's why we must keep returning to the source of this goodness, this life, through prayerful silence and stillness, through penitent awareness of suffering and wrong, through openness to the Spirit of God. And what difference does this make as we join with others in service of the world? As we share common values and commitments with non-believers? Well, if we are ourselves sourced in the energy of divine life, we bring this energy into our participation. Maybe on the surface, it's hard to discern any difference this makes, anything distinctive in Christian social action. For myself, I do sense a difference from a time when I was more personally defended, more concerned to justify myself by my good works, more anxious about success. And now I experience a different freedom to participate and a sense of being much more reliably sustained and at peace in the midst of things. I sense this is helpful for others. But maybe that's just me. And the secular saints get there in their own way. In the end, I'm not sure we can answer in general or abstract terms what difference Christianity makes, which is where the writer of this comment got to as well. Perhaps he said we should not, as a general rule, expect or build some grand Christian program. And this seems to me right. All we can do is seek to be true to our calling and then to offer ourselves humbly alongside others. The gifts that we bring with us, the extent to which they enable the flourishing of those around us, well, perhaps we're not the ones who can judge. And the fourth and final theme that emerged from your questions and comments concerned the issue of action. People asked, how can we take responsibility to impact the outcome of suffering in this world in a positive way? And how, in practical terms, do we live with this sense of having interest groups in our societies who appear to put their own gain before the common good? Well, partly this is because I'm running out of time, but I wonder if these are questions each of us needs to continue to engage for ourselves and in conversation with our communities. I don't want to dodge the questions, but I don't feel I have particular wisdom to offer here, except that I hope that all we've just been reflecting on helps us to recognise more clearly the true nature of dynamics at work in our society and in efforts to engage the world's need, and to recognise the nature of the gifts we might be called to offer. And so give us more resources for discerning personally and in community what action we are called to, what participation might look like for us. And I would love to hear how some of you are now thinking about these questions of action and involvement in the light of this exploration of Christian virtue. So let me conclude. By his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope. This living hope is a rupture in the system. With the resurrection of Jesus, with the coming of the Holy Spirit, hope dawns as the inbreaking of possibility in a world not yet conformed to the love and life of God. it dawns as the energy to participate in its realization. To be born into a living hope, therefore, means to be precipitated into a liminal space, a form of life that can neither settle down uncritically with the world as it is, nor in complacent assurance that, in the end, she'll be right. It's a form of life founded in radical trust in God's goodness, which yet makes us in some ways more rather than less exposed to the pain of the world. Some of you wrote of having a sense of this current world crisis too as a liminal time. A collective rock bottom experience, someone wrote, that serves to break open our hearts and minds to allow the Holy Spirit to work through us. And someone else wrote, a gift in that we are longing and searching for a source to well up within us, like a lot of the poets and mystics allude to. In the first talk, I quoted from Pope Francis, who has recently described the present moment as a propitious time to be open to the Spirit, who can inspire us with a new imagination of what is possible. The Spirit, he says, does not allow itself to be closed in or manipulated by fixed or outmoded methods or decadent structures, but rather moves us to make new things. I would say that to be born into a living hope is to know ourselves participants in this Spirit-led renewal of life. It's to be willing to suffer the pain of the world in trusting obedience and to give ourselves for love of it. And in this, our prayer, the quality of our being, and our action are all evoked. Or, as 1 Peter puts it, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy.
Thank you, Sarah. It's amazing how you've not only kept your numbers throughout these 6 weeks, just occurred to me, but how you've really created a sense of a journey into, as you did with your talks on contemplative Christianity, but how you've created a sense of traveling together into a new land, really, and with understanding and naming things in new ways, and yet bringing out the meaning of the traditional terms and descriptions as well. So I think you've given us a wonderful and prophetic and you've been guiding us, leading us, but you haven't been giving us all the answers. So you've been teaching with really exemplary skill and finesse. So thank you so much for that. Well, somebody, yes, well, some of the comments coming in here from Carlos, profound, oh, I just lost it. Oh, a minute. Profound and marvelous answers. God bless you. Such a wonderful series of talks from Alison. Amazing summary of the last 6 weeks from Caroline. Well done. Heartfelt thank you. From Hans. Thank you for your sparks of light. Here we are. We've just lost that one, but they are not lost, but are reflected upward by our hearts. So thank you so much for this series. I was not able to attend all due to my work schedule, but the ones I've attended were wonderful. I'm looking forward to listening to them, to the archived ones. What a great ending that the Holy Spirit will break through as we head towards Pentecost. Superb series, you've blessed us indeed. So really, could you list the, so really, clearly you've touched and opened many hearts and minds, and people feel deeply, richly touched and awakened and inspired, I think, by what you've shared. And it occurred to me, one of the things I'd like to do is talk about this with people in our community who are on the School of Meditation website, who are putting up our online courses, to see whether we maybe could work with you sometime in the future to use this and these talks for an online course, which would allow more interaction and responses and discussion than we were able to do in this 1 hour. But several people have said, so I'd like to take that up with you later, and I'm sure a lot of people would have more time to explore the insights and the new land, really, that you are seeing and entering. So somebody asked if we could show pictures of all the participants. 2 people actually asked for that. I think if they had, it would have been, if we decided on the whole not to do that at these larger webinars, because otherwise people are tempted just to go through looking at everybody. And then several people have said that they would prefer not to be on the screen. But I don't know whether Luke can tell us whether it is possible to have one final revelation. Oh, sorry.
It's not.
Oh, it's okay. Hi, Nancy. Many thanks for your question. Alas, it's not possible to display all the attendees in the Zoom webinar format. This only works in the meeting format, unfortunately. So, okay, we're a webinar, not a meeting. So, well, I think we've got a few minutes. We want to give you a little virtual present in a moment, and we have also just discussed, well, some people have mentioned, wouldn't it be great if you could come to Bombo and give this here in Bombo, so that we would have the beautiful setting here to be able to explore these perspectives with you. Anyway, so that's a heartfelt invitation from us all here.
That sounds very nice. You know, if we're ever allowed to leave the country again.
And you may have. What's that?
I was just going to say, I am conscious of how good it would be to have more chance to interact and talk about these ideas with people, because people's experience is, you know, it is such a resource and makes you realize how subtle and complex some of these themes are. And it would really be enriching for us, I think, to do something like that.
Yeah, well, I think today, I mean, I think throughout it's been clear that you have been listening and responsive to people's comments and questions, and today you really wove it together in a very creative synthesis of what you've been saying, and people have felt connected and listened to, and that of course enriches you, your ideas, and enriches them with a feeling of being heard. But if there are any questions coming through, anybody here like to raise any questions? Oh, one person says, "Phew, I'm in my pajamas." So she's very pleased not to be exposed. What was it? Just go down a bit more. Could
that
these
was very like my scarves as well.
6 talks be made available on CDs for purchase? Oh, and more time to listen while commuting in the car. Well, they will be available for downloading. If we were to go back maybe 20 years, we would make them into CDs as well. But
download on YouTube.
Oh, YouTube, yeah, you can get them on YouTube. They can be downloaded from the website, but we'll give some more information about that on the website if you go there. I should also just say Sarah is part of the editorial group, small group of people who are in charge of the Contemplative Path Through the Crisis website. And we meet every week with 3 or 4 of us to look at the content, new content, and make sure that it's being put up, refreshed on a regular basis, not overloaded, but very regular. So Sarah's contribution to that is a very important one. Somebody said they would like to use your talks for a study group that they are organizing. Articulate your commentary with such clarity. You are a breath of fresh air. That's nice. You should put that on the back cover of your next book. And is it possible to have the texts? Are we going to have any publication? I think we will certainly put pressure on you to do that. And I'm very pleased to announce that the text of the talks that Sarah gave at the John Main seminar in Vancouver on contemplative Christianity have been edited now and will be published quite soon, I think. So, are there any questions anybody would like to raise? Any thoughts to share? Any comments you'd like to make? Thanks.
Well,
What it's meant.
Yeah, no, I would like to thank you. I mean, your talks have been very, they have inspired me. They touch me. So it's wonderful. It's really, and your language is so reachable, even for a non-English speaking person. It's really, yeah. I've heard many people in the community saying that your talks are wonderful, and I totally agree with that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, Sarah, I agree. It's wonderful. And I was telling you before you gave your talk, but I think it's worth saying to everyone, you could easily have taken us on a head trip out there around these huge concepts. And instead it's felt like this wonderful regard was watching us learning to ride our bicycles with the little side wheels as you took us on a journey of learning to ride rather than getting the idea. So thank you.
It's a beautiful image. Thanks, Giovanni. There is actually a question here on Q&A. Would you consider your definition of obedience with Beatrice Brutteaux's notion of spondic energy from letting go? Are you familiar with her ideas? I'm a little familiar, so I'm familiar with that term. She uses a spondic energy, but I hadn't thought of it in connection with obedience. But if I remember rightly, she is talking about that relinquishing so as to allow space for the energy of God to kind of rise up and overflow. So I think that does resonate with that concept of obedience and I, as Father Lawrence said, it's people's questions that have kind of forced me to keep coming back to this obedience to try to clarify it a bit further. So I feel like we together have kind of been working our way towards something like this. And yeah, I think there probably is a relationship, but I'm not as deeply familiar with her ideas to say much more than that.
Thank you. Well, we are going to be obedient to our self-discipline of keeping this to 1 hour, but we look forward to coming back to it in some of the ways we've been describing, maybe through online and of course through some study groups maybe, and through publication. But we thank you from our hearts and from minds as well that have been touched and refreshed by your insights and your great teaching ability to open new perspectives and to venture into them with courage, but caution, but with real courage. So it's been a wonderful experience of the mind and the heart, and you're reminding us of the centrality of contemplative prayer to this new vision that you're describing. That is very grounding and opens up a whole other sense of possibility. You know, that if this contemplative experience is at the heart of it, then this contemplative experience, however we enter into it, may also be the way for a more universal awakening. So thank you again. And we're going to give you a virtual thank you, and then we shall fade from the screen. We're going to, okay? You good?
Let your beauty shine on me, Lord. Shine in my heart, my soul, and my soul. Let your beauty shine in me, Lord. Shine and make me whole. Let your beauty shine on me, Lord. Shine in my heart, my mind, my soul. Let your beauty shine in me, Lord. Shine and make me whole.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank
Love
you.
to you. Lots of love. Thank you.
Well, thank you.